The news spread as swiftly as a raven on a clear, windless day. House Redwyne had forbidden the sale or shipment of its famed arbor wines to King's Landing. Rumors whispered through the halls of the Red Keep, slithered beneath the doors of taverns in Flea Bottom, and were carried by the lips of merchants docked at the bustling city port. At first, many at court dismissed it as a passing spat, a mere inconvenience that would soon be resolved. After all, the arbor depended on trade as much as King's Landing depended on wine. Yet days passed, then weeks, and no casks arrived from the arbor. The holdfasts that once served the capital's thirst with a steady flow of red, white, and sweet summer wine remained empty, and the small council began to grasp that this was no passing quarrel. In the arbor, the lords and merchants under House Redwyne had their own reasons for igniting such a crisis. The impetus was not entirely personal. Men spoke of high tariffs imposed by the crown and the dwindling influence the arbor enjoyed under the current regime. There were also whispers, darker ones, that House Redwyne had grown weary of the crown's favoritism toward other houses, especially in matters of royal charters. The situation culminated in a bold decision. The arbor would withhold its wine from the Iron Throne. At first, the crown attempted to solve this with courtesy. The Master of Coin sent letters urging them to reconsider. The Master of Ships quietly suggested a private negotiation. The Queen, seated in her solar, maintained that war was not an option for a mere trade disagreement. A handful of merchants, desperate to maintain their fortunes, tried to smuggle casks into the city, but House Redwyne's fleet was vigilant. Any ship suspected of carrying their vintage was intercepted and forced to turn about. A single bold merchant vessel managed to bribe its way past the arbor's patrols, but when it docked in King's Landing, the wine was discovered to be fouled, salted with brine and undrinkable, perhaps a subtle message that House Redwyne meant business. As the weeks wore on, the capital's discontent grew louder. The taverns had never faced such a dearth of wine. The lords who drank only the finest arbor vintages griped at feasts. The Queen's table began to serve lesser wines from other regions, inferior in flavor and prestige. Whispers of an insult to the dignity of the crown grew. Courtiers joked bitterly that the small council would demand they drink water next. Beneath this all, a tension like a tight bowstring spread throughout the Red Keep. King's Landing had grown dependent on the arbor for more than just simple libations. The wines were a symbol of prosperity, not to mention a significant trade commodity. House Redwyne's decision was not wholly unilateral either. Lords from the Reach, especially those who owed fealty to Highgarden, watched from afar. The Tyrells, proud as they were, recalled the centuries of alliance with House Redwyne. Some of the smaller lords questioned the wisdom of antagonizing the Iron Throne, and uneasy alliances began to shift behind closed doors. For House Redwyne to act so brazenly, they must have had some measure of reassurance. Men whispered that the Redwynes possessed more than mere coin. Their fleet, second in strength only to the Royal Navy itself, was formidable, and they had the advantage of holding the seas around the arbor. And so, the months rolled on and the capital suffered. The dryness of throats turned into dryness of patience, and the crown demanded action. Quietly, the Master of Ships began to muster the royal fleet. Captains were ordered to check their stores, and whispers spread among the sailors that they would soon leave Blackwater Bay for a show of force. The Master of Coin shifted funds to pay mercenaries with sailing expertise. Ravens flew to lords along the Crownlands and the Stormlands, demanding support for a blockade of the arbor if diplomacy failed. By the time the Royal Navy was ready to set sail, House Redwyne had already doubled its patrols. Swift, single-masted vessels watched for suspicious activity, while larger war galleys hovered just out of sight, near the hidden coves of the arbor. House Redwyne's seat at the arbor was well protected by fierce currents and treacherous reefs. But more than that, the Redwynes had spent generations perfecting their maritime strength. Even the Ironborn, though they seldom admitted it, approached the arbor's fleet with caution. When the Crown's forces finally took action, they did so under the banner of protection. Officially, the King's order was to ensure the free and open trade of all goods across the Narrow Sea and along the Westerosi coasts. But no man at court doubted the real reason. to force House Redwyne to surrender its stranglehold on Arbor Wines. The first test came when 3 royal warships approached a cluster of merchant vessels flying the Redwyne colors. The king's ships demanded to inspect their holds for contraband. The Arbor sailors refused, citing their lord's orders. Tempers flared, and soon arrows were nocked. The standoff ended with the Arbor ships turning away at full sail, slipping deftly out of range, and the royal warships deciding not to chase them into the deeper, reef-strewn waters. That day, there was no bloodshed, only the promise of conflict to come. Word of the confrontation reached King's Landing within days. A swirl of courtly intrigues and small council debates followed. Some advised caution, fearful of losing the vital trade in other goods that might become collateral damage in a naval war. Others, including influential members of the crown's closest allies, urged direct action to teach House Redwyne and the rest of the Reach a lesson in obedience. Soon enough, a new rumor filtered through the city. The Redwynes were seeking alliances beyond Westeros. Merchant ships from the free cities were seen dropping anchor near the Arbor, and gold changed hands in large sums. Spices, silks, exotic wares from Essos, these began to flow through the Arbor in ways that circumvented King's Landing. The Master of Coin, anxious over lost revenue, fumed at the throne's side, urging an embargo of all Redwyne ships. The Master of Whispers quietly confirmed these rumors of foreign alliances and insisted that if the crown did not act decisively, House Redwyne would become an even greater power at sea, maybe powerful enough to tip the balance of all trade in Westeros. The king finally gave a direct edict. Any ship bearing the sigil of House Redwyne that refused inspection or tribute would be turned away, or boarded by force. In response, the Lord of the Arbor, Galadon Redwyne, a tall, spare man with stern gray eyes, declared that any royal ships entering waters near the Arbor would be considered a threat and could be fired upon without warning. This was the spark that would ignite a naval trade war. On a misty morning, a royal squadron of 5 war galleys sighted a Redwyne fleet in the distance. The Arbor ships were imposing, 2 large war galleys, flanked by swift, maneuverable smaller vessels. The wind favored the Redwyne sails. Commands were shouted, oars dipped into the water with a splash, and the 2 navies bore down upon one another. King's Landing's ships had more men, but the Redwyne seamanship was legendary. In the face of the capital's might, they held position, letting the currents work in their favor. A single arrow arced through the air from one of the royal galleys, flaming tip tracing a curve against the gray sky. It struck the side of a Redwyne vessel, snuffing out in the wood without serious damage. Perhaps it was fired in warning or by accident, no one would ever know, but it was enough to unleash chaos. The Redwynes let loose a volley of their own. Dozens of flaming arrows rained onto the deck of the lead royal galley. Shouts of fear and anger mingled with the sound of burning sails. Return fire soon followed, and for a time, the stretch of sea between the warships was aflame with missiles and curses. Grappling hooks caught hold. Men boarded each other's ships with drawn blades and bared teeth. Sailors and soldiers alike cried out as the clang of steel rang across the waves. Redwynes, wearing the sigil of the Grapes cluster on their surcoats, fought with the desperation of those defending their livelihood and home. The royal soldiers, loyal to the Iron Throne, fought with pride and anger, determined to break the blockade once and for all. By the time the sun reached its zenith, the smoke of battle hung heavily over the waters, and broken masts jutted at odd angles from the sea like the bones of drowned giants. When the fighting ended, it was not through negotiation but exhaustion. The royal squadron managed to capture 1 Redwyne war galley, though it was badly damaged, and 2 of the crown's ships lay half-sunk, their keels splintered, with survivors clinging to flotsam. The Redwynes retreated toward the protection of the reefs, their sails scorched and men wounded but hearts unbowed. If this first clash was a test of resolve, both sides showed they were prepared to pay a steep price. In the following days, ravens flew furiously across the skies. The Master of Ships wrote to the Lords of the Stormlands, urging them to send their smaller fleets to join the crown's cause. House Valerion of Driftmark, proud of its ancient maritime heritage, readied its own warships. The crown intended to strangle the Arbor, preventing any trade from leaving those shores. Let them keep their wine on the arbor, the king declared, until they learned humility. The strategy, at least on parchment, seemed sound. Cut off the arbor's shipping lanes, interdict any Redwyne trade with Essos or other regions of Westeros, and starve House Redwyne of the coin it needed to maintain its fleet. Yet House Redwyne was not without allies and cunning. The Tyrells in Highgarden wrote polite but pointed letters to the crown, stressing that the Reach was integral to the realm's stability and prosperity. There was no open condemnation of the Iron Throne, but the language was carefully measured. One could almost sense the threat behind the pleasantries. Highgarden was watching, and if the war at sea dragged on, it might disrupt the harvests, perhaps even hamper shipments of grain and other produce to King's Landing. Whispers circulated that the Tyrells found the king's approach too heavy-handed, that a sword was being used where a quill might suffice. Still, Highgarden did not openly side with the Arbor, not yet. They watched and waited, as the Tyrells often did, for the winds of advantage to blow one way or another. The Redwynes, for their part, secured their own packs. Merchant ships from Bravos, Pentos, and Lys were welcomed at the Arbor. Their captains promised safe harbors and favorable taxes on goods. Some foreign captains, enticed by the opportunity for profit, risked slipping through the crown's blockade. More than a few had success, navigating the labyrinth of reefs and hidden coves with the guidance of Arbor scouts. Others were less fortunate, seized by the crown's navy, who confiscated their cargoes and imprisoned the crews. As tensions rose, the Master of Coin realized that the cost of maintaining this blockade, paying sailors, providing for the upkeep of ships, and the bribes to keep certain merchants loyal, was draining the treasury. In King's Landing, the lack of Arbor wine was becoming a symbol of the city's woes. Feast halls that once offered casks of the Arbor's finest now served thin ale or sour Dornish reds. Nobles complained, knights grumbled, and even small folk began to murmur that the king had let pride overshadow the realm's prosperity. But the king, emboldened by the initial victories at sea and anxious about appearing weak, pressed on. He gave a royal decree offering bounties for the capture of Redwyne ships. Privateers flocked to the city, lured by the promise of gold and sanctioned looting. Soon, the waters around the Arbor were thick with sails of many colors, all hunting for the distinctive Redwyne grape sigil. With each passing moon, the conflict escalated. The Redwynes commissioned new ships to be built in secret. Carpenters worked day and night in hidden shipyards carved out of rocky coves on lesser-known isles near the Arbor. Meanwhile, the crown poured money into the Royal Navy, refitting older galleys and hiring mercenary sailors from across the narrow sea. Both sides engaged in a dangerous dance of cat and mouse along the southwestern coast of Westeros. Sometimes, the crown's ships would seize a Redwyne merchant vessel loaded with prized goods, grain, fruits, or shipments of cloth. At other times, the Redwyne fleet would ambush a royal convoy, capturing or sinking supply ships. Many good men drowned in the open sea, and the once thriving maritime trade routes became fraught with peril. Amid this turmoil, individuals on both sides sought a path to peace. The Master of Whisperers was one such figure. He dispatched envoys in secrecy to meet with Galadon Redwyne's bannermen, hoping to lure them away with promises of royal favor. House Redwyne, too, had its informants in King's Landing. Servants in the Red Keep noticed that certain courtiers met behind locked doors late at night. The Redwynes made it known they were open to negotiation, but only if the crown lifted its naval blockade and ceded certain trading privileges to the Arbor once again. The king balked at these demands, insisting that House Redwyne must yield first. One sweltering afternoon, as the stench from Flea Bottom rose in waves through the windows of the Red Keep, the small council gathered. The Master of Coin was the first to speak, anger coloring his cheeks. His ledgers showed that the war at sea was costing the crown a fortune. Tariffs were plummeting, with trade disrupted along the entire western coast. Merchants from the Westerlands were wary of sending goods by ship, knowing the seas were dangerous. Food prices in King's Landing began to rise. Already, there were small riots in the streets, and the gold cloaks struggled to keep order. "I warned you," the Master of Coin barked at the king, though he took care to bow his head a moment later in apology. "This war devours our coffers by the day. Even if we win, How many years will it take to recover from these losses? The king, seated on the Iron Throne, glowered down from his vantage. I will not be dictated to buy the arbor, he growled. We must maintain the authority of the crown. A single banner should not hold us hostage. The master of ships spoke next. He was a seasoned man, his hair gone white from decades at sea. He explained that the Redwynes knew the coastline near the arbor too well, and their new alliances with the free cities made the blockade more difficult to enforce. There were only so many ships in the Royal Navy, and they could not be everywhere at once. Any weakness or gap would be exploited. The Queen, in a quieter voice, suggested that it might be possible to appease House Redwyne by lowering the tariffs that had sparked the conflict in the first place. A small concession, perhaps, to end this bloodshed and restore normalcy to the realm. But the king brushed aside the suggestion, believing it would be a show of weakness. Thus, the war at sea continued into a second year. Even the small folk began to call it the Wine War. Sailors on both sides told grim tales of battles fought under moonlight, where ships clashed in the narrow channels. Entire crews were lost to the watery depths. The cost in lives grew, but still no resolution was in sight. Unrest simmered across the Seven Kingdoms. In the Reach, where House Tyrell's vassals churned out bountiful harvests, some lords began to wonder if they might turn their trade caravans away from King's Landing as well. After all, if the crown could not safeguard shipping routes, it might not be able to ensure fair market prices. In the Westerlands, House Lannister eyed the conflict with caution, mindful of the implications for their gold mines and trade. The king's intransigence concerned them, but they were not eager to antagonize the Iron Throne openly. Meanwhile, House Redwyne continued to refine its tactics. They set hidden watchtowers on smaller islands near the arbor, constructed from driftwood and stone, manned by sharp-eyed lookouts who could spot approaching fleets. Clever signals, mirrors by day, lanterns at night, relayed the positions of the royal ships. Sometimes the Redwynes would lead crown warships into shallow straits, where hidden shoals awaited. At least one royal galley ran aground, its hull ripped open to the sea. The desperation on both sides fueled acts of cruelty that even a year prior would have been unthinkable. A few privateer captains, flying the royal banner, raided small fishing villages on the lesser isles around the arbor, looting their meager stores and burning huts. The Redwynes retaliated by capturing a pair of crown supply ships and executing the officers. The realm watched with mounting dread, fearing that this conflict at sea would soon spill onto land. Anxiety crept through the Red Keep. The king's bannermen questioned the wisdom of continuing a war that gained them little but lost them much. But the king, stubborn in his pursuit, believed that if he relented, every great house would test the crown's resolve in the future. For him, it was a matter of principle and power. In the third year of the blockade, the small council orchestrated a massive naval expedition, a fleet larger than any assembled since the days of ancient Targaryen kings who once conquered the seas. The banners of House Velaryon, House Baratheon, House Lannister, and loyal crownland houses fluttered from the masts. Hundreds of ships, large and small, set sail from Blackwater Bay. Their plan was bold. A full-scale assault on the arbor, aimed to break House Redwyne's fleet once and for all and force them to come to the negotiation table in chains. The king promised titles and lands to any lord or knight who distinguished himself in the campaign. The realm held its breath, for such a display of force had not been seen in decades. Galadon Redwyne and his captains anticipated the move. Scouts along the coast warned them that an armada was forming in King's Landing. Shipbuilders raced to complete the newly constructed vessels, and Redwyne archers gathered vast stores of arrows, pitch, and wildfire obtained. Some whispered, through shadowy deals with mercenaries from the free cities. The war was about to reach its climax. The crown's grand fleet set sail under clear skies, hoping to make swift time around the southern coast of Westeros. The king believed in a sudden, overwhelming strike. Yet as they neared the arbor, the weather turned foul. A storm battered the great armada, scattering ships for miles. Lightning lit the night sky like the wrath of the gods, and enormous waves crashed onto the decks, sweeping some sailors overboard. More than a few ships had to turn back, battered and broken, while others found themselves hundreds of leagues off course, drifting in unfamiliar waters. When morning came, the battered royal fleet was in disarray. Still, the battered ships regrouped as best they could, continuing toward the arbor, albeit with diminished strength. On the horizon, they saw the Redwyne fleet awaiting them, black sails rippling in the wind. The Redwynes had used their watchtowers and signals to track the Crown's approach, storm or not. They knew exactly where the main thrust of the royal assault would come, and they planned accordingly. Thus began the largest naval engagement in recent memory. It would later be known as the Battle of the Arbor, though some called it the Great Wine Battle, for the sea itself seemed red with blood by the war galleys from the Crown advanced in tight formation, their prows reinforced to ram enemy ships. The Redwynes arrayed themselves across the mouth of the main harbor leading to the arbor, forming a defensive line. Fire was the weapon of choice that day. The Redwynes launched flaming arrows and hurled pots of wildfire, turning the water's surface into roiling patches of green flame. The Crown's ships retaliated with their own barrage, setting ablaze the rigging and decks of the Redwyne galleys. Amid the chaos, the thunder of war drums mixed with the screams of men. The decks became slaughter yards. Grappling hooks reeled ships together, and men fought at close quarters, swords clashing while the sea sprayed them with salt and blood. Captains roared orders to rowers below deck, urging them to pull faster, to maneuver around sinking hulks, to avoid the spread of wildfire. Bodies piled in the water, drifting amid debris. The stench of charred wood and burning pitch filled the air. The intensity of the fighting ebbed and flowed, like the tide itself. A Crown flagship cut through the Redwyne line, ramming and splitting an enemy war galley in half. But its triumph was short-lived when two smaller Redwyne vessels flanked it, setting the flagship ablaze with arrows and a catapulted pot of flaming oil. Meanwhile, a group of smaller Crown ships broke away to attack the arbor from the north, only to find themselves ambushed by hidden Redwyne scouts in shallow channels. Some ships were forced aground, their crews scrambling onto rocky shores where Redwyne archers picked them off. All day, the battle raged, until the setting sun cast the waters in a deep red hue. The battered remnants of both fleets drifted among the wreckage. The Crown's armada had inflicted serious damage on House Redwyne's defenders, sinking many key war galleys and capturing a few supply vessels. Yet it had also taken devastating losses. Many of the Crown's largest ships, including the pride of its navy, were aflame or sunk. Neither side had emerged the clear victor, and both were too exhausted to press the advantage. As darkness fell, the fleets withdrew, each gathering what survivors they could from the sea. The aftermath of that single, colossal battle changed the tone of the war. In King's Landing, the reality of the cost began to settle in. The treasury was nearly empty. Merchants complained that commerce was stifled. The war at sea had turned many potential allies away from the Crown, fearing that the monarchy was on a ruinous path. The lords of the Stormlands began to fret about their own coastlines, left underdefended while their ships were engaged near the arbor. On the arbor, Galadon Redwyne surveyed the smoldering remains of his war galleys with grim pride. Many of his best ships were lost, and the arbor's once flourishing trade routes were now fraught with danger. But House Redwyne had not bowed, and the king had not triumphed. Even so, Galadon knew that continuing this fight would bleed his people dry. Word reached him that many small folk on the arbor were suffering. Without new goods coming in, certain necessities had grown scarce. The small islands that supported the arbor's wine production faced ruin, as they struggled to import the supplies needed to maintain the vineyards. At last, the lords of the realm began to whisper of a peace summit. The king's small council grew bold enough to speak their minds, warning that if the war continued, it might incite open rebellion in other regions. The queen quietly sent messages to Highgarden, urging them to intervene and help broker peace. The Tyrells, seeing an opportunity, decided that the time was ripe to step in as the mediators. They would invite both sides to parley under their watchful eye in the lush gardens of Highgarden, where honor was prized and hospitality sacred. The invitation was accepted, albeit reluctantly, by both parties. They agreed to a truce, a cessation of hostilities at sea, so that delegates could travel safely to Highgarden. Many sailors and lords wondered if either side would break the truce, but neither did. The thirst for more bloodshed had lessened after the catastrophic losses at the Battle of the Arbor. Now it was the art of negotiation that would determine victory or defeat. The assembled delegation at Highgarden was a grand affair, despite the tension. The Tyrells made a display of generosity, laying out tables laden with fresh bread, fruit, and fine cheeses, though the Arbor wine was conspicuously absent from most of the tables. Galadon Redwyne arrived with a small retinue, including several trusted captains and advisors. Their faces were still etched with the memory of the horrors at sea, and they wore their bruises openly, as if to show the cost they had paid. From King's Landing came the Master of Coin, the Master of Ships, and a few highborn lords with close ties to the throne. The king himself did not attend, presumably because he wished to maintain distance should the negotiations sour. The queen's presence, however, was noted, accompanied by a small guard, suggesting that the crown did indeed take these talks seriously. For a day and a night negotiations stretched on. The Tyrells, graceful and hospitable, guided discussions in their sun-dappled garden chambers. Beneath archways of flowering vines, delegates argued over trade rights, tariffs, shipping routes, and reparations. The Master of Coin insisted that House Redwyne must pay restitution for the crown's losses, while Galadon Redwyne demanded compensation for the destruction wrought on the Arbor's fleet and the blockade's damage to his house's livelihood. Round and round they went, the tension so thick it could be sliced like a wedding cake. At the end of the second day, there was still no agreement. Tempers flared, and the possibility of renewed conflict loomed. But a small turning point came when, after hours of debate, the queen, looking weary but resolute, asked Galadon Redwyne directly what it was he truly wanted. He spoke plainly: recognition of the Arbor's autonomy in maritime trade, relief from the high tariffs that had sparked this conflict, and a formal apology for the crown's blockade. The queen considered his words carefully. She knew well that no apology from the king would be forthcoming, yet she recognized the realm's dire need for stability. In a private audience with Galadon that same night, the queen offered a compromise. The crown would reduce tariffs on Arbor wine and certain goods from the Reach. House Redwyne would be allowed favored trade status, meaning fewer inspections and restrictions. In exchange, House Redwyne would cease all hostilities, open its ports to royal ships, and pay a moderate sum to the crown's treasury for the destruction inflicted. The official word would be that it was not an apology, but a concession of mutual benefit, carefully worded so that both sides could claim victory. Galadon Redwyne mulled over the terms, aware that he held no illusions about forcing the king to bow and scrape. He also knew that continuing the war might weaken the Arbor beyond repair. If he walked away now, with at least some semblance of autonomy restored and a promise of renewed trade, it might be the best outcome his people could hope for. The next morning, he agreed in principle, provided that the final writing omitted any language that suggested Redwyne guilt for starting the war. The last hurdle was the king's pride. The queen, in a carefully worded raven, laid out the terms, emphasizing that the crown would emerge strengthened by the realm's renewed unity, that the presence of Redwyne wine in King's Landing would be a welcome sign of prosperity and order. She warned him of the alternative: continued strife, a drained treasury, and the likelihood that other great houses might exploit the chaos. With reluctance, the king assented. A final draft of the accord was drawn up under the watchful eyes of the Tyrells, who ensured that the words were fair to both parties. It was no grand friendship. There was too much blood in the water for that, but it was a workable peace. House Redwyne would supply wine again, the blockade would be lifted, and maritime trade would resume under revised tariffs. Both sides agreed to forego further retaliation or demands of vengeance. The lords who had lost ships or men would have to swallow their grievances in the hope that, with time, prosperity might return. Thus, after 3 grinding years of warfare, the wine war came to a quiet end. The navies withdrew. The battered ships returned home. The Arbor docks that had once been ringed by war galleys turned back to honest merchant vessels, albeit with fewer sails than before. In King's Landing, the first shipments of Arbor wine since the start of the conflict arrived with muted fanfare. Many in the city, from the lowest dockhands to the highest lords, wept with relief to see the casks rolling down the piers. The inns and taverns once again filled with the familiar scent of rich red wine vintage. For a while, the capital seemed to breathe easier. Yet not everything was as it had been. The realm had discovered the fragility of royal authority when confronted by a single great house determined to defend its interests. Other houses watched and learned. The scars from the wine war lingered for years. The crown's treasury needed time to recover, while House Redwyne had to rebuild its fleet and woo back foreign traders who had been frightened off. Scores of widows on both sides mourned husbands, fathers, and sons lost at sea. A generation of sailors and soldiers bore the memory of that tumultuous conflict, recalling friends who had drowned or burned alive in the midst of battle. And though peace reigned on the surface, the seeds of future discord had been planted. The Tyrells, whose intervention had been crucial, emerged with a heightened sense of their own importance. They had shown they could mediate a crisis in which the Iron Throne itself had floundered, and that fact would not be forgotten by them or other ambitious houses. Within the arbor, some whispered that Galadon Redwyne should have pressed for more, that the king's humiliations had not been enough. More radical voices claimed that House Redwyne should have severed itself entirely from the crown and declared the arbor a freehold, untouchable and self-governed. In the corners of King's Landing, certain courtiers privately seethed, believing the Redwynes had escaped true punishment for their insolence. In the end, the wine war joined the annals of Westerosi history as a lesson in pride and politics. The realm learned that even the mightiest monarchy could be challenged by a determined vassal if that vassal wielded control over a vital commodity. The seas, once again open for trade, carried not just goods but also stories of how a single domain had nearly brought the crown to its knees by turning a beloved pleasure, arbor wine, into a tool of warfare. Those who survived told tales in taverns of blazing ships and swirling storms, of cunning strategies and narrow escapes in the night. The scalding taste of salt air lingered in the nightmares of many a sailor, and though peace was declared, it was an uneasy truce born of necessity, not genuine reconciliation. House Redwyne returned to making the finest wines in all the 7 kingdoms, shipping them to taverns and halls from Dorne to the Wall, each bottle a subtle reminder that power could rest in unexpected places. Seasons turned, vines grew heavy with fruit, and casks once more flowed into King's Landing. Feasts resumed their splendor, albeit overshadowed by the knowledge that even the simple pleasure of wine could become a weapon in the Game of Thrones. In the background, alliances continued to shift like the tide, and those who paid attention realized that the wine war, though ended, had altered the political landscape. Neither House Redwyne nor the Iron Throne would forget those tumultuous years, nor would any who had witnessed how close the realm came to unraveling over the cutoff of its favorite vintage. Galadon Redwyne stood on a windswept cliff on the arbor one late afternoon, staring out at the endless sea. The horizon was calm now, not a trace of smoke from burning sails or the flash of wildfire. He let the sea breeze wash over him, taking in the briny scent and letting his tired eyes rest on the shimmer of sunlight dancing across the water. In the small harbor below, shipbuilders toiled to repair the still damaged wharves, and new hulls were beginning to take shape, vessels that would soon carry wine and trade goods under the Redwyne banner once more. But the memory of war lingered in the lines of his face, in the ache of old wounds. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to see a trusted captain approach. The man said nothing for a moment, only offered a respectful incline of his head. They both understood without words. The cost of House Redwyne's stand had been great, the taste of victory mingled with the bitterness of compromise. And yet the seeds of independence, of defiance, had been planted deep in the arbor's soil. A single house had shown it could force the crown to the table, that it could wage war not with swords alone, but with the power of controlling something the realm held dear. In time, histories would be penned, telling of how the arbor withheld its wine from the capital and sparked a bloody conflict at sea. Some would romanticize the struggle, painting the Redwynes as heroic defenders of their rights. Others would condemn them as traitors and troublemakers, men who plunged the realm into chaos for personal gain. The truth, as always, was more complicated. It lived in the battered hulls of ships lost to the depths and in the hearts of those who had fought to protect what they loved, be it the honor of their house or the pride of their throne. King's Landing carried on, its taverns once again filled with drunken laughter and the swirl of red in goblets. But now, even the most carefree lord or lady sometimes paused after a sip, recalling how easily that wine could have been lost to them forever. The small folk, less wrapped in pride and more concerned with simple survival, welcomed the return of commerce and better prices for daily goods. Yet many had lost loved ones who served in the war fleets, and the memory of hardship lingered. Far away, on a merchant galley bound from Mir to Old Town, a captain told his foreign passengers of the wine war. He described how the seas off the Arbor had looked like a smith's forge at night, ablaze with wildfire, how the men had fought with savage desperation. He spoke of the cunning and bravery of Arbor captains, weaving in half-truths and grand exaggerations. But the real moral of his tale was simple. If you hold the thing that men desire most, you can bring even kings to heel. The king himself never openly admitted regret for the war, but he grew more cautious in the years that followed. He tightened the crown's alliances with key houses, ensured the navy was restructured and better funded, once the treasury allowed. He recognized that the times were changing, that power now lay not only in the fields and armies of the great lords but also in the sea lanes and the flow of trade. The war had taught him and his successors a lesson they would not soon forget. For House Redwyne, life returned to a semblance of normalcy, but it was never the same as before. The memory of blockade and battle had imprinted itself on every cask rolling out of the Arbor. The men who loaded the ships sometimes remembered the friends lost to the watery graves. The day the Arbor was almost starved of outside supplies, the nights spent in anxious vigilance, scanning the dark horizon for the king's warships. Each time a merchant's sail appeared, hearts clenched for just a moment before calmer heads prevailed. Still, the vines grew. The harvest continued, lush and bountiful. The casks were filled and sealed with wax, stamped with the sigil of House Redwyne. Bit by bit, the trade routes reopened, and coin once more changed hands. Life, as it always did in Westeros, marched on. The storms that had once ravaged these waters were gone, for now, replaced by the gentle swells of peace and commerce. In the grand Game of Thrones, the pieces were never still, but for a brief moment, a precarious equilibrium had been found. And so ended the war begun by a single decision: to deny King's Landing the Arbor's wine, and thereby deny it its pride, its pleasure, and its sense of invulnerability. Neither side emerged unscathed, and no one who bore witness to the wine war could claim to be unchanged. The sea had swallowed enough blood and steel to remind all involved of the terrible cost of ambition and obstinacy. Yet from that cost arose new insights, alliances, and cautions, shaping the future of the Seven Kingdoms long after the last cask of the disputed vintage was tapped. In the years to follow, tavern bards would sing ballads of the wine war, some comedic, teasing the king's thirst for the Arbor's grapes, others tragic, lamenting the drowned sailors and the orphans left behind. Lists of the fallen were etched into plaques in certain ports, a sobering reminder that trade was rarely just about coin. Sometimes it was about pride, power, and the precarious balance of a realm that spanned from the cold north to the sun-scorched deserts of Dorne. House Redwyne kept its vow, shipping again to King's Landing, though ever mindful that these were the same lords who had tried to starve them out. The crown accepted their cargoes with carefully measured gratitude, conscious that a second conflict would be ruinous for both sides. The Tyrells, satisfied with their role as peacemakers, turned their attention to other matters, never forgetting that they had once reigned in the wrath of the Iron Throne and shaped the outcome to their liking. And thus, as casks rolled onto the docks of the city, sealed with the Redwyne crest, it seemed to many that the realm had found its old habits again. Toasts were raised, deals were struck, gold exchanged hands, and the illusions of normalcy resumed. But for anyone willing to look deeper, the specter of the wine war hovered like a ghost over every transaction. It was a testament to how quickly prosperity could crumble when pride ran unchecked, and how, in the swirling tapestry of Westerosi politics, a single thread could unravel the mightiest of tapestries if pulled at just the right angle. The ocean breeze carried away the last echoes of naval battles, but it also whispered reminders that the seeds of future strife might be sown in the very next negotiation, the next slight, the next cup of wine poured at the royal table. For while the seven kingdoms often boasted of their unity under a single crown, the wine war showed that unity was as fragile as a newly forged blade, strong enough to cut, but vulnerable to fracturing if struck in just the right place. In the twilight of his years, Galadon Redwyne would sit with a goblet of his family's vintage, swirl it, and take a slow sip while gazing at the sun dipping into the western sea. He would reflect on the war that had consumed so many lives, sometimes wondering if there had been a better way. But then, as he savored the rich taste of the Arbor's most treasured export, he remembered how near the crown had come to breaking him and his people. Perhaps, in another world, the Redwynes and the Iron Throne might have resolved their differences with diplomacy alone. Yet in the end, it had taken the clang of steel and the roar of wildfire to ensure that House Redwyne's voice was heard. Across the sea, in King's Landing, a new generation would grow up with stories of the time when wine was scarce and the city's lords grew restless. I'd see it as a sign that the war was based on a lie. Others would question your right to call yourself king in the north if your father lives. Rivalries would fester. The Lannisters would spin it all to their advantage. I can serve you better from the darkness. Robb stared at him, heartbreak etched on his face. He looked older than his years. At length he dipped his head. If that is your wish, father, then so be it. Relief coursed through Ned, though it was tinged with sadness. He wanted nothing more than to stand beside his son, to guide him openly. But the realm's cruelty demanded otherwise. Thank you, he said softly. Do you know anything of your sisters? Robb's expression clouded. Sansa remains a captive in King's Landing. She sends letters. They are carefully worded, but I can sense her fear. As for Arya, she vanished after you were taken. We know nothing. Some say the Lannisters hold her too. Others say she escaped. Ned swallowed the lump in his throat. The notion of Arya alone in the world chilled him. But she was resourceful, fearless. He had to believe she found her way somehow. I will go to King's Landing, he murmured. Robb's eyes widened. That's suicide. Cersei and Joffrey. I won't come in as Ned Stark, he said, a bitter smile touching his lips. I have other faces now, other names. I will watch them, wait for the moment to strike. Robb shook his head, clearly troubled. I barely recognize you, father, but I trust you. I only pray the old gods watch over your path. Ned reached out, clasped Robb's hand. And yours. Rule well, my son. Keep the North united. I will do what I must to bring the Lannisters down. Robb placed his free hand over Ned's. Go with all the strength of House Stark. Ned nodded. They embraced one last time, father and son, before Ned turned to slip from the tent. It took all his will not to linger, not to let that moment of familial love soften his resolve. War demanded sacrifice. He was no longer the same man who had marched south with Robert. He left the camp as stealthily as he arrived, returning the confused sentry to his post. The guard might think it a dream or a strange visitation. By dawn, Ned was miles away, heading south toward the capital. As he traveled, he reflected on the path ahead. King's Landing was a nest of vipers, but it was time those vipers tasted the venom of the man they had once condemned to die. He thought of the poisons hidden in his pack, the trained reflexes that could silence a target before they even knew they were threatened. And yet, doubt gnawed at him. Was this truly justice or just revenge? Was there a distinction anymore in a world so broken? He thought of the kindly man's last warning. Once you unleash death, it cannot be undone. But then he remembered Sansa's tear-streaked face, Joffrey's mocking grin, Cersei's cold smile, the hush of the crowd, the glint of sunlight off Island Payne's sword. No, he thought, there can be no justice as long as they reign. So he forged on, another traveler on the dusty roads to the Crownlands. It took him weeks of cautious movement, slipping past war-torn villages, avoiding bands of soldiers. Everywhere he went, he heard rumors of the war. Renly Baratheon had been slain under mysterious circumstances. Stannis was rallying at Dragonstone. Tywin Lannister marched on Riverrun, and King Joffrey reveled in his cruelty in King's Landing. At last, Ned arrived within sight of the city. The great walls loomed, the heat was stifling, the stench of refuse and humanity thick in the air. He felt a coil of loathing in his gut at the memory of how this city had betrayed him. But he did not approach the gates as Eddard Stark, nor even a recognizable figure. He had dyed his beard a rust color, worn a battered straw hat, dressed in the rough attire of a traveling peddler. His posture hunched slightly, and he walked with a subtle limp. He had tested this persona in small ways along the road, passing off as a wandering tradesman. The guards at the gate took him for a ragged peddler of trinkets. They demanded a small bribe to let him pass. He offered a few copper coins, feigning poverty. One of the men made a crude remark about the worthless wares Ned carried, a small pack of potions that he claimed were herbal cures for the pox. In truth, they contained lethal substances gleaned from the House of Black and White. The gates swung open, and Ned passed into the teeming streets. King's Landing assaulted his senses with noise, stench, heat, and the press of bodies. But he felt a strange hush in his soul, a sense of grim purpose. He would slip into the city's underbelly, learn what he could, and find a way to strike at the Lannisters. He found a small, dingy room to rent near Flea Bottom, well away from prying eyes. The landlord asked few questions if the rent was paid. For days, Ned mingled with the crowds, quietly collecting rumors. He learned that Sansa was kept in the Red Keep, paraded at court functions to maintain appearances. Joffrey had grown even crueler, if that was possible, indulging in petty tortures of servants and animals. Cersei still held power, though her father Tywin overshadowed her strategies. The city was tense, anticipating an attack from Stannis at any moment. Ned began to set his plan in motion. He needed a way into the Red Keep, a method to reach Sansa without alerting the entire court. The old Ned Stark would have marched up with a handful of loyal men, demanded justice, and tried to rescue her honorably. That man was gone. Instead, Ned visited the black markets by night, forging connections with those who dealt in bribes and secrets. He bartered for information about the hidden passages within the keep, the ones Varys had once used. His silver and cunning gleaned him partial outlines of the labyrinth beneath the castle. He tested the knowledge, venturing into disused tunnels, and nearly found himself lost more than once. But the skills he acquired in Bravos helped him to slip through with minimal risk. Days stretched into weeks. Carefully, systematically, Ned mapped a route from Flea Bottom sewers into one of the Red Keep's lower storerooms. From there, he discovered an ancient passage leading behind the walls of the castle. He saw the hidden openings that peered into the throne room, the council chambers, the royal quarters. He learned the schedule of the guards, the points where security was lax. He spied on Joffrey's court from behind hidden grates. He watched Sansa stand stiffly beside the throne, forced to endure Joffrey's humiliations. The sight of her tear-stained face awakened an ache that nearly broke his composure. He wanted to rush out, cut Joffrey's throat then and there, carry Sansa away. But that would be a fool's move. The moment the alarm was raised, they would both be overwhelmed by Lannister guards or the King's Guard. No, he had to be patient. Strike from the shadows swiftly, accurately. When the moment finally came, it was on a night when Joffrey indulged in one of his private entertainments in Maegor's Holdfast. Sansa would be forced to attend. The queen was otherwise occupied, so rumor said, meeting with Grand Maester Pycelle about something or other. The day prior, Ned had managed to slip a potent powder into the wine stores that Joffrey's personal cupbearer drew from. It was designed to weaken the limbs, cloud the mind, and eventually still the heart, but slowly so that few would suspect immediate poisoning. Under cover of darkness, Ned navigated the hidden corridors. His blood thundered in his veins. He could hear Joffrey's shrill laughter echo through the walls. There, in a small chamber lavishly appointed with silken cushions and flickering lamps, Joffrey sprawled in a chair, goblet in hand. Sansa sat stiff and silent, face pale. Several attendants hovered nearby. The Hound stood at the door, grim-faced, though it seemed he was only half paying attention. Ned watched through a secret opening in the wall as Joffrey tossed back wine. A predatory satisfaction tightened in Ned's chest. The poison would take effect soon, though not instantly. He waited. He saw Joffrey begin to wobble slightly. The Boy King muttered something about the room spinning, demanded that one of the attendants stop shaking the walls. The Hound, noticing something amiss, stepped forward. "Your Grace." Joffrey blinked, as though trying to focus. He tried to stand, legs wobbling. "I feel hot," he rasped. "What?" Sansa, eyes wide with alarm, moved to help him, but he shoved her away. Then he collapsed to his knees, retching. The attendants panicked. The Hound barked orders, telling them to summon a maester. Ned sensed his chance. Swiftly, he loosened the hidden panel and slipped into the chamber, dagger in hand. The attendants gasped, but they were unarmed, untrained. The Hound whirled, sword half-drawn. For an instant, Ned faced Sandor Clegane's burned visage. Then Ned flicked his wrist, sending a small puff of blinding powder into the air between them. The Hound recoiled, cursing, eyes watering. In that moment, Ned closed the distance to Joffrey. The Boy King was on all fours, coughing and heaving. Ned grabbed him by the hair. He felt that vile, golden head in his grip, the same child who had smiled as Ned was condemned to die. He pressed the dagger to Joffrey's throat. Sansa cried out, "No!" Her voice trembled. Please." She sounded conflicted, terror and perhaps a spark of pity, or just dread of the consequences. Ned did not falter. He glanced up at his daughter, eyes pained. "Forgive me, Sansa." In a savage motion, he slashed the blade across Joffrey's throat. Blood spurted. Joffrey's eyes bulged with horror, trying to scream, but only a wet gurgle emerged. Ned dropped the body to the ground. The attendants shrieked. The Hound, recovering, lunged forward, sword raised. Ned braced to fight, but Sansa threw herself in front of him, as if driven by some wild instinct. "Sandor, no," she pleaded. The Hound halted, eyes flaring with a storm of emotions. In that frozen instant, Ned took Sansa by the arm and whirled her behind him. He expected the Hound to attack, but the man hesitated, torn between the devotion he had for Sansa and his sworn duty to the king. Joffrey was already dying, choking on his own blood. Chaos erupted as guards rushed in from the corridor. Ned tossed another vial of the noxious powder to cover their retreat, seized Sansa's hand, and bolted back through the hidden panel. The Hound roared after them, but there was no immediate pursuit. They raced through the secret corridors, Sansa stumbling in shock. "Father?" she gasped, tears streaming down her face. "Father, it's you?" "Hush," Ned breathed, dragging her along. "We must move quickly." He led her down the twisting passages into the darkness of the keep's underbelly. Her mind spun, reeling with confusion and fear, but she clung to his hand as if he were a lifeline. Joffrey's blood still stained Ned's dagger. He had done it. He had killed the Boy King. Trumpets sounded an alarm above. Torches flickered in every corridor as guards scrambled. They would turn the castle inside out to find the assassin. Cersei, Pycelle, the Kingsguard, none would rest. The city would be on lockdown. But Ned had planned for this. He half-guided, half-carried Sansa through the labyrinth until they emerged at the base of a dry well in an abandoned courtyard. From there, Ned slipped them through a lesser-used side gate, bribing a single guard with enough gold to buy his silence or his flight from the city. They found themselves in the muddy, starlit outskirts of King's Landing, panting for breath. Sansa was trembling uncontrollably, eyes wide with terror and confusion. Ned gently clasped her shoulders. She flinched but didn't pull away. "Sansa, it's all right," he whispered. "You're safe with me." Her lips trembled. They said you were dead." Everyone said, "I saw them." She broke off, voice cracking. Ned pulled her into an embrace. She pressed her face to his chest, sobbing softly. How is this possible?" He stroked her hair, his voice husky with emotion. "A tale for another time. I couldn't leave you there, Not with him. She shuddered. You killed him, father. The king. For a moment, Ned felt the weight of what he had done. He had murdered a boy, though that boy was cruel beyond measure. He had shattered the old code of honor he once followed so devoutly. But looking at his daughter's tear-streaked face, he found no regret. He was no king, Ned said quietly. He was a monster. The alarm bells still echoed behind them, and Ned knew they had little time. He took Sansa's hand. We must go. She nodded, eyes brimming with fear, but she followed. They vanished into the night, a father and daughter forging a path through the war-scarred realm. The city behind them roiled in chaos. A king was dead, his throat slit by an unknown assassin. Whispers would soon spread of how it happened, who was responsible. The realm would be thrown into further turmoil. Cersei would lash out, Tywin would unleash fury, but they would not find Ned Stark so easily this time. It was vengeance, swift and brutal. But for Ned, it was only the beginning. The Lannisters had more heads, more serpents in their nest. Tywin, Cersei, others who had orchestrated the downfall of House Stark. And beyond them, an entire realm that needed to be set right. He had once thought that honor would be the surest sword to wield. Now, he realized that in the cunning labyrinth of kings and queens, there was only one weapon that truly leveled the field: death itself. He guided Sansa north, planning to keep her hidden as best he could. He would see her safely out of the capital's reach, perhaps sending her to join Robb. Or he might hide her somewhere in the Vale if that was safer. Meanwhile, he would continue using the shadows, becoming the very threat that once he had abhorred. Perhaps one day, if the realm found peace again, he might lay down his secret faces and rest. But until then, Eddard Stark would remain a dead man walking, a phantom with a single mission: to ensure that those who had betrayed him would pay, and that his children would never again suffer at the hands of false kings. And so the North's quiet wolf walked the darkness, carrying poison in one hand and a dagger in the other, guided by the memory of a family whose future hinged upon a father's vengeance. He had traded honor for cunning, truth for masks, the open field for the hidden corridor. Yet even then, in the depths of his soul, he knew he remained, in some small way, Ned Stark of Winterfell, doing whatever it took to shield those he loved from the cruelty of a world that had shown no mercy.